Walter's jacket was faded, an olive drab that had seen decades of wear, its elbows patched with care. On his left hand, where a ring finger should have been, there was only a smooth, scarred stump, a detail most overlooked, like the man himself. A faint tattoo of an eagle and anchor peeked from beneath his rolled-up sleeve, the ink blurred by time, but still proud. He sipped his coffee, his eyes tracing the grain of the countertop, lost in thoughts that no one bothered to ask about. The diner's morning crowd, truckers, retirees, a few young mothers with kids, moved around him, their lives loud and present, while Walter seemed to fade into the background, a ghost of a different era. The bell above the door jingled, and three men, all in their mid-40s, strode in, their work boots thudding against the linoleum. They wore flannel shirts and carried the easy confidence of men who knew the town and its rhythms. They laughed too loudly, their voices cutting through the diner's hum as they slid into a booth near the window. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a goatee, glanced at Walter, his eyes lingering on the missing finger, the worn jacket, the solitary plate of toast. He nudged his friend, a wiry man with a baseball cap, and whispered something. A chuckle followed, sharp and careless. The third man joined in, his laughter louder, bouncing off the diner's walls. Walter's shoulders stiffened just for a moment, but he didn't look up. He understood. He'd heard laughter like that before, decades ago, in hospital wards, in bars, in the quiet moments when people thought he couldn't hear. He took another sip of coffee, his face unreadable, and slid his plate closer, retreating further into his corner. The waitress, a young woman named Sarah with a quick smile and tired eyes, brought Walter's check. "You good, hun?" she asked, her voice kind but distracted. Walter nodded, his voice low. "Just fine, thank you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. Inside, tucked beside a few crumpled bills, was a faded ID card, its edges curling, the words, United States Marine Corps, retired barely legible. He didn't show it to anyone, he never did. But his fingers brushed against it, a quiet reminder of who he'd been. Across the diner, the men's laughter grew sharper, their conversation turning to Walter without naming him. "Old guy looks like he's been through it," the goateed man said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Bet he lost that finger in a lawnmower or something stupid." His friends snickered and a few heads turned, some with discomfort, others with indifference. Walter kept his eyes on his plate, chewing slowly, his jaw tight. He wasn't angry, not exactly. It was more a weariness, a weight that had settled in his bones long ago, when the world stopped noticing men like him. The bell jingled again, and the diner's air shifted. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding without effort. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with close-cropped silver hair and a posture that spoke of discipline. His suit was crisp, a single star pinned to his lapel, a subtle mark of a retired general. His eyes scanned the room, sharp and assessing, before landing on Walter. For a moment their gazes met, and something unspoken passed between them. The general's expression softened, not with pity, but with recognition. He crossed the diner in long, purposeful strides, stopping at Walter's table. "Mind if I join you, Marine?" the general asked, his voice steady, carrying the weight of authority tempered by respect. Walter blinked, caught off guard. He glanced up, his pale blue eyes meeting the general's. "Sir," he said, his voice rough but polite, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The general didn't wait for an invitation. He pulled out a chair, sitting across from Walter, his movements deliberate. "Saw the tattoo," he said, nodding toward Walter's sleeve. "Korea?" Walter hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Chosin Reservoir, 50 to 51. The general's eyes flickered with something deep. Respect, memory, maybe both. "Hell of a fight," he said quietly. "You were 1st Marines?" "Yes, sir," Walter replied, his voice steadier now. "2nd Battalion." The general leaned back, his hands resting on the table. "I'm Tom Hargrove. Served in Nam, later Desert Storm. Never got to Chosin, but I know what it took." He paused, his gaze steady. You're one of the frozen chosen. Walter's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. It had been years since anyone had called him that. Before he could respond, the laughter from the booth cut through again, louder this time. The goateed man leaned forward, his voice carrying. Look at that! Old timers swapping war stories? Bet they're making it all up. His friends chuckled, and a few other patrons shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the booth and Walter's table. The general's jaw tightened. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto the men in the booth. The air in the diner grew heavy, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Walter's hand tightened around his mug, but he said nothing, his face a mask of calm. The general, however, was not so restrained. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and crossed the diner in 3 steps. Every eye followed him. Gentlemen, he said, his voice low but cutting. You've got something to say about that man over there? He pointed toward Walter, who sat still, his eyes fixed on his coffee. The goateed man faltered, his smirk fading under the general's stare. Because I'd like to hear it, loud and clear. The diner fell silent. Sarah froze behind the counter, a rag in her hand. The men in the booth shifted, their laughter gone, replaced by an awkward tension. The wiry man in the baseball cap opened his mouth, then closed it, glancing at his friends for support. None came. The general didn't wait for an answer. That man, he said, his voice rising just enough to carry, fought in conditions you can't imagine. Temperatures so cold, your rifle froze to your hands. Outnumbered 10-1. He came home and he's still here, sitting quietly, not asking for your respect, but you damn well owe it to him. The goateed man flushed, his hands fidgeting. We didn't mean anything by it, he muttered, but the general wasn't done. You don't get to laugh, he said, his voice like steel. Not at him, not at what he's carried. He turned, facing the diner now, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. This is Walter Gaines, Marine, Korea, one of the bravest men I never met until today. He paused, then raised his hand in a crisp salute, holding it steady, his eyes locked on Walter. For a moment, Walter didn't move. Then, slowly he stood, his back straightening, his missing finger hidden in a clenched fist. He returned the salute, his hand steadied despite the years. The diner was silent, the weight of the moment pressing against every heart in the room. And then, from Walter's jacket pocket, a small folded photograph slipped out, fluttering to the floor. It landed face up, a black and white image of a young Marine, barely 20, standing beside a snow-covered tank, his face grim but resolute. The general bent down, picking it up gently, his eyes tracing the faded lines. Walter, he said softly, holding the photo out, tell me about this. Walter's eyes met the general's, and for the first time that morning, a spark of something alive flickered in them. He took the photo, his fingers brushing the edges, and began to speak. What happened next in Millie's diner would change Willow Creek forever. To find out how Walter's story unfolds and the legacy it leaves behind, subscribe to Hoffman's Stories for Part 2 of The Quiet Salute. Notice the quiet heroes in your own community. Sometimes a single moment of respect can rewrite their story. Walter Gaines held the faded photograph in his calloused hand, his thumb tracing the edge where the young Marine stared back at him. The diner's silence pressed in, heavy with anticipation as every eye watched him. The air still smelled of coffee and syrup, but now it carried something else, a weight, a reverence, as if the room itself held its breath. The general, Tom Hargrove, stood beside him, his salute lowered, his eyes steady, with quiet encouragement. Walter's voice, when it came, was low, rough like gravel, but clear enough to carry across Millie's diner. This was December 1950, Walter began, his gaze fixed on the photo. Chosin Reservoir. Me and my squad, we were pinned down for days. Snow up to our knees, wind that cut through you like a knife. The tank behind me, he paused, his jaw tightening. It was out of fuel. We used it for cover, but it didn't help much when the mortars started falling. The general nodded, his face solemn. You were with 2nd Battalion, you said. Fox Company? Walter's eyes flicked up, a faint surprise in them. Yes, sir. Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. We held the line at Hagaru-ri, lost a lot of good men. His voice cracked just for a moment, but he steadied it. This photo. It was taken the morning we broke through. A war correspondent snapped it, said we looked like ghosts. The diner's patrons leaned closer, some unconsciously, drawn into the weight of his words. Sarah, the waitress, stood frozen behind the counter, her rag forgotten. The three men in the booth, the ones who'd laughed, sat silent, their faces pale, their earlier bravado gone. The goateed man stared at his hands, his fingers twisting a napkin into knots. Walter's eyes dropped back to the photo. I kept this because it's the only picture I've got of Jimmy. His voice softened, and for the first time, a faint tremor ran through it. My brother. He was 19, didn't make it out of Chosen. The general's hand rested on Walter's shoulder, a gesture both firm and gentle. He was with you out there? Walter nodded. Side by side, he took a bullet covering me. I got this. He held up his left hand, the missing finger stark in the diner's light. Lost it to frostbite a day later. Didn't feel it till they got me to the hospital, but Jimmy, he was gone. He folded the photo carefully, slipping it back into his pocket. I don't talk about it much. Doesn't seem like anyone wants to hear. The general's face hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. He turned to face the diner, his voice rising, clear and commanding. This man, he said, pointing to Walter, fought for every single one of us in this room. He carried his brother's memory through hell and brought it home. And he's been sitting here, day after day, invisible to most of you. That ends now. He stepped forward, his boots clicking on the linoleum, and addressed the booth directly. You three, you laughed at him. You mocked a man who gave more than you'll ever understand. You're going to make this right. It wasn't a request. The goateed man, whose name was Carl, stood awkwardly, his face flushed. We didn't know, he stammered. I'm sorry, Mr. Gaines. Really? His friends nodded, their eyes downcast, mumbling apologies that sounded genuine, if clumsy. Walter looked at them, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. It's all right, he said quietly. You didn't know. But his words carried a weight that silenced the room again, a reminder of the gap between those who'd served and those who hadn't. The general wasn't finished. He turned to Sarah, who was wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. Ma'am, can you get me a pen and some paper? Sarah nodded, scrambling behind the counter. She returned with a notepad and a pen, her hands trembling slightly. The general took them and began writing, his movements precise. When he finished, he tore off the sheet and handed it to Sarah. Pin this up somewhere everyone can see. Sarah unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. She looked up, surprised, then nodded. She grabbed a thumbtack from a bulletin board near the register and pinned the note to the wall behind the counter, where the daily specials usually hung. The words written in the general's bold hand read, To the people of Willow Creek, honor Walter Gaines, USMC, Chosin Reservoir, 1950. A hero sits among you, never forget. A murmur ran through the diner, soft at first, then growing. An older woman at a nearby table, her hair pinned in a neat bun, stood and began to clap. Slowly, others joined, tentative at first, then stronger, until the sound filled the diner. A steady rhythm of respect. Walter's face flushed, his eyes dropping to the floor. But a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at his lips. The general leaned closer to Walter, his voice low. You deserve this, Marine. And more. He reached into his own pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was a silver pin, the emblem of the 1st Marine Division. This was mine, he said. I want you to have it. Walter's hand shook as he took the pin, his fingers tracing the familiar eagle, globe, and anchor. Sir, I can't. You can, the general interrupted. And you will. Semper Fi, Walter's eyes glistened, but he held himself steady. Semper Fi, he whispered back, pinning the emblem to his jacket. The diner's applause grew louder, and for the first time in years, Walter felt seen. The days that followed were different in Willow Creek. The note on the diner's wall became a fixture, a quiet reminder of Walter's presence. People began to stop by his table, not with grand gestures, but with small ones. A nod, a handshake, a thank you whispered over coffee. Sarah started comping his meals, though Walter protested every time. "It's on the house," she'd say, her smile brighter now. The three men from the booth, Carl and his friends, came back the next week, quieter, humbler. They bought Walter's coffee and sat with him for a while, listening as he shared stories of Chosen, of Jimmy, of the men who never came home. Word spread beyond the diner. The local VFW post, long dormant, started holding meetings again, and Walter was invited to speak. He was hesitant at first, his voice unsteady, but the room listened in rapt silence as he recounted the frozen nights, the camaraderie, the cost. A high school history teacher brought her class to hear him, and one of the students, a shy girl named Emma, asked if she could record his stories for a project. Walter agreed, and soon a small booklet, The Frozen Chosen of Willow Creek, was circulating in the town library, its pages filled with Walter's memories and Emma's careful transcription. The town council, spurred by the generals, visit, voted to dedicate a bench outside the post office to Walter and other local veterans. It was simple, with a brass plaque that read, "In honor of Walter Gaines and all who served, Willow Creek remembers." At the dedication, Walter stood quietly, his new pin gleaming on his jacket, as the mayor read a proclamation. A small crowd gathered, including Carl, who'd helped organize a fundraiser for the bench. When the ceremony ended, Walter sat on the bench, his hands folded, watching the flag across the street ripple in the breeze. For the first time in decades, he felt anchored, not adrift. The general didn't stay long in Willow Creek. He had other towns to visit, other veterans to find, but he left his card with Walter, promising to check in. They exchanged letters over the months, brief but meaningful, two Marines sharing a bond that needed few words. Walter kept the general's letters in his wallet next to Jimmy's photo, a new weight to carry. One morning, as winter settled over Willow Creek, Walter walked into Millie's diner to find a small crowd waiting. Sarah had organized a surprise. Veterans Day was approaching, and the diner had put up a wall of photos, letters, and mementos from local veterans, with Walter's at the center. The photograph from Chosin hung framed, its edges preserved under glass. Below it, a handwritten note from Sarah read, "To Walter, our hero. Thank you for teaching us to see." Walter stood before the display, his throat tight. He didn't speak, but his hand rested on the frame, his fingers brushing the glass. The diner was quieter now, not with silence, but with warmth, the kind that comes from shared understanding. Carl approached, holding out a coffee. "On me," he said simply. Walter took it, their eyes meeting, a nod passing between them. As Walter sat at his usual table, the morning light catching the silver pin on his jacket, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pride, not exactly, but a quiet dignity, a sense that his story, Jimmy's story, had found a home. The flag outside snapped in the wind, and for a moment, Walter heard the distant echo of a Marine hymn, carried across the years. Walter Gaines reminded Willow Creek that heroes walk among us, often unseen, their stories waiting for a moment of recognition. Look around your own community. Who's been overlooked? A small act of kindness, a nod, a thank you, can change a life. Subscribe to Hoffman's Stories to read more tales of quiet courage and the power of respect.